All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. And we try to load you up with some great theories of everything that you can mull around in your mind and help yourself so that you can figure out your strategy for paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, including your own personal sovereignty. And we try to check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, and also things like magnum opuses and tour de forces and earth-shattering discoveries. And they generally emanate from obscure sources, things you probably have never heard of before, or only dimly. You maybe have heard the name, but you don't know what it is. And it's generally difficult material, stuff that you either is going to take a great deal of commitment and effort to learn because of the complex nature of it, or that's going to be difficult to learn because you have to unlearn a ton of other stuff, or you have to confront your own falsehoods that are in your head. And so what I'm saying sometimes is not what you want to hear. And so that also makes it very difficult. The whole red pilling process entails, maybe you resisting quite a bit until eventually it feels inevitable. And you're like, okay, I guess what I believed was totally wrong. And, that's kind of the nature of it. Eventually, we're all going to end up figuring out that the vast majority of everything that we've learned throughout our whole lives is wrong. And today is our 257th video that we've done on what we call the Reciprocal Church, named after Dewey B. Larson of the Reciprocal System of Theory, which I consider to be at least the greatest modern theory of everything that's out there, the most complete. He unites all the fields of science, or all the major fields of science, and he also unites science with religion. We're going to try to fill in a little bit of that religious aspect here with looking at different forms of spiritual practice that you probably haven't heard of, but that are things that you can believe in, things that you can reproduce, things that you can repeat, things that you can rationalize. They are rational. They might not look rational right away, but you can figure it out, kind of like magic. It's a magic trick only until you figure out how the magician did it. It's kind of like the fine line between technology and magic. And these are also things that you can believe in because many of them have equations, and they are things that, in this case, we're talking about breaking codes. When you break a code, it puts you in a whole different world, because now you can interpret all these other things according to that code. And if that brings you signal instead of noise, then that even further reinforces the code. And that's what we're looking at today with this book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult by Michael Menesgotz, M-E-N-A-S-G-O-T-Z. This book just came out 6 months ago, but it is the last in a long line of books that have come out, particularly in the last 25 years, but all the way really going back over the last 150 years. Of books that present evidence that the New Testament was written by the Romans. It was not written by a bunch of semi-literate desert dwellers in Palestine, writing in Greek. It was written by the highly educated elite of Roman society, the Caesars, and their court historian or court poet or court dramatists, and also some of the other puppet kings. This happened basically in what is called the Flavian dynasty from 69 until 96 AD. The emperors Vespasian and his two sons Titus and Domitian. Vespasian was the main military general in a war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. In 69 AD, there was also 68, 69 AD, there was a Roman civil war, which resulted in the war, the year of the four emperors. Nero was murdered, then Galba was murdered, Otho was murdered, Vitellius was murdered, and then they brought in Vespasian. And it's kind of like, no thanks. You know, I'd like to take a job that has a longer, longevity, longer than 3 months. But Vespasian actually ruled for 10 years. And then when he died, Titus came in. And then Titus was appointed as Vespasian's replacement as the general when Vespasian became the emperor. Now, what happened was Vespasian, when he was doing one of his sieges, I think it was at Jotapata, the story goes, if you read Josephus and Josephus's book, the history of this era, called the War of the Jews, or the Jewish War, Josephus was one of the military generals for Palestine, or for the Hebrews, and he surrendered to Vespasian. He was always lukewarm about it. He's like, we're never going to win this. You know, we have no chance of winning. I don't know why we're fighting. But eventually Vespasian surrenders, and he surrenders to, Josephus surrenders to Vespasian. And at that moment, he has an epiphany that is two epiphanies. The first is that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. So I defect to the Romans. And I see into the future, and I see that Vespasian, one day you will become emperor. And then a year or two later, when Vespasian, in fact, does become emperor, he pardons Josephus and adopts him as a member of his family. That's why he's known as Flavius Josephus, from the Flavian dynasty. Flavius means blonde or golden. And he brings Vespasian to Rome with him to become one of the court historians. I find that story totally unbelievable, impossible to believe. Almost the exact same thing happens with another Jewish leader named Ben Zakkai, Yohanan Ben Zakkai. And he surrenders to, he says it's Vespasian, but at the time it would have had to have been Titus. And he predicts that he will become the new emperor. And when he becomes emperor, Vespasian hooks him up with a land grant to build a college for the study of the Hebrew scriptures. And that was the beginning of what is known as rabbinical Judaism. So we already know that the Romans created, they basically at least created the seeds for rabbinical Judaism. And in almost the exact same maneuver, they brought Josephus to Rome. And now when you read Josephus's War of the Jews, you will realize that it was written by the same people who wrote the New Testament. Josephus wrote the New Testament. Now, whether Josephus was a real person or whether he was a pseudonym is a different question. But several historians have figured out that Josephus is the person who wrote the New Testament because of all the correspondences between the New Testament and War of the Jews. And this goes all the way back to the first century. Many of the, or at least second century, many of the Christian, early Christian sects, Josephus was part of the biblical canon. It was part of the Bible, even though it's just as long as the Bible is. And even today, one sect called the Preterists still have Josephus as part of their canon in their Bible. But most of them discarded it when they realized that what happens in Josephus is that Jesus in the Gospels, in many places, he predicts what's going to happen. In particular, he predicts the fall of Jerusalem, the temple at Jerusalem. At the place that he makes the predictions or the prophecies, usually made in a symbolic manner, like a parable or symbolic speech, that thing at that very same location 40 years later is fulfilled by Titus, the general. And this happens over and over. It's fulfilled literally also, not like symbolically or something like that. It's fulfilled literally at the same location, and usually exactly 40 years to the day later. So that's what they did. They wrote the Gospels, backdated them by 40 years, but they wrote both of the scripts at the same time. They were written at the same time by the same people. And so what that does is it builds a little bit of a trap, because you can get caught up into the Jesus worship, but then you recognize that the prophecies of Jesus all point to Titus. So Titus is the second coming of Jesus. We're all, in the book of Revelation thinking that, the second coming of Jesus is about to happen. Well, if you read the Wars of the Jews, you will recognize that the second coming of Jesus happened in 70 AD, or 70 to 73 AD, in the first century. So forget about that Revelation thing coming true. So this book by Michael Menescats examines this very question. And what he does is he makes a graph. He puts the book of Luke. So he just uses the book of Luke, but he borrows from the other Gospels, and sometimes even from the epistles and from Revelation. They were all written by the Romans, but the epistles were written in a later period, not in an earlier period. And they were written by, they were all written by Roman royals or close relatives to the Roman royals. We can get into who we think wrote them, but that's more. It's pretty solid, but it's kind of more advanced. This is mainly, I think, the main point is that the Romans wrote the New Testament, and we can prove it by looking at all of the parallels between the two. But what he does, Menescats, is he puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis, chapters 1 through 24. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then he puts Wars of the Jews on the horizontal axis, paragraphs 1 through 694. It's like a seven volume work. Paragraphs 1 through 694 on the horizontal axis. When he finds a parallel, he puts a dot there, okay? Chapter 8, paragraph 600, put it right there. Through digging and following up on clues, pulling in some extraneous information sometimes, and, again, following hints, and just by being very familiar with the text, Menescats found 250 parallels between Wars of the Jews and just the book of Luke. And he graphs them out, and they spell a 5-letter word in Roman, or 5 letters in Roman, APTVS, or TUS possibly. So it's not noise, it's signal. It makes a definite pattern. But then if you look at the parallels, some of the parallels are like practically breathtaking, and how detailed and specific the parallels are on the one hand, and how well hidden they are on the other hand. But you have to kind of understand the Roman mindset. They loved these games. They loved to play word games and puns. And I mean, a lot of ancient people did. The Jews were into the punning too. If you read the Talmud, there's a ton of punning going on in the Talmud also, which is the rabbinical Judaism. And so what Menescats does is he goes through all of the parallels kind of one by one and shows them. And some of them have been more obvious than others. Some of them have been weaker than others. He says that the ones in the first couple books are much weaker than the ones later on. Now you could say it's because those two earlier books were added on later to complete the pattern, or to add to the pattern the A and the P. Or you can say maybe they got better at it as they went along. And at the start, they weren't so good at weaving in these patterns, and so they're pretty primitive or something. And then afterward, they started getting more skilled at it. But by the time we get to the T, the V, and the S, some of them are. And what's also incredible about them is that they're just really mean-spirited, mocking, ridiculing, bawdy, in poor taste, brutal, grim, pornographic, cannibalistic, pedophilic. They're everything. It literally is psychological warfare. And that's why they did it. They did it to mellow out the Jews. The Jews had been revolting from them for over 100 years. And this last war, 66 to 73, Titus and Vespasian were both wounded in the war. So, they were angry. And they came up with this very angry piece of propaganda against the Jews. And the idea is to mellow them out by proposing a Jewish hero and even Messiah and Savior, who is a Prince of Peace, who believes in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, who believes in turning the other cheek and tolerating oppression, who believes in carrying your backpack for an extra mile. Or the Roman backpack for an extra mile, who believes that the Roman centurion slave owner is got the greatest faith in all of Israel. So that's what this is about. And Menescats agrees with what I'm saying mostly, but he refines the points, and several other authors have made similar points, including Joseph Atwill, Roman Piso, Henry Davis, Abelard Reuchlin, and then all the way back to Sir Ronald Syme, James Ballantyne Hannay, and Bruno Bauer in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they were all, at University of Berlin, Oxford University. It's not like these guys were like quacks or something. They were like the best in their field. But they got blacklisted for what they were doing. Imagine at that time period, it was even harder to try to expose Christianity. But, you can say that this is anti-Christian, but really it's pro-Christian because they are mocking you. I'm trying to save you from being mocked over and over again. And so are these authors. And they even say as much. Joseph Atwill says, I have appreciation for a lot of things that the Christians have done and a lot of the beliefs that they have. And I really regret having to bring this news to you. But this is a mockery, and it's not true. you know, they have psyoped us. This is a psychological operation, and it's still working to almost 2,000 years later. Okay, so we're going to get into the text here. He's talking about the Big Dipper, the 7 stars, and how the APTVS pattern, which is on the thumbnail to this video, is a it is kind of like a zodiacal chart. Okay, Sangwon Lee discusses the passage in Revelation about Jesus and his 7 stars, identifying a connection. I believe this is Luke 9:62. Identifying a connection with certain Roman coins, which, surprise, are those of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. He shows that some of these coins also have the inscription. It's in Greek. I don't read Greek. I don't even know how to pronounce it. There's a couple sigmas in there, and most of the other letters I recognize, but I don't know how to pronounce it. So anyway, which is a reference to a Cretan, or Cretan, from Crete, to a Cretan originating myth about the constellation of the Plough, or the Big Dipper. This idea that God lives in the constellations is supported by the text in Jewish War by Josephus, where Titus gives a rambling speech to his men and suggests that noble souls go to live among the stars. And in noble souls, we can be sure that he means to include himself. And now we're looking at Jewish War. Unfortunately, he doesn't say what paragraph it is, but he says it's book 6, chapter 1, paragraph 5. Titus gave a speech to his men saying, quote, "It is well known that those souls severed in battles are joined to that company placed among the stars to become good demons and heroes." Apparently, the Slavonic version of Josephus, which is slightly different, adds the word demigods and show themselves as such to posterity. And here we must observe, that's the end of the quote, here we must observe that there are some famous scholars, modern scholars, for example, Richard Carrier, who had used completely different methods and who also arrived at the conclusion that the Gospels are driving at the idea that God came from and resides in not merely heaven, but rather the heavens, as in the firmament, literally the sky. The upshot is that Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian all went out of their way to associate themselves with the 7 stars of the constellation of the Plough, the Big Dipper. And from this, we can infer that the 7 stars of Jesus in Revelation are also the stars of the constellation of the 7-ox plough, also known as the Big Dipper, which, coming full circle, helps us be confident that when Luke 9:62 says that he who pushes the plow is apt. Now remember, the 5-letter code is aptus, A-P-T-U-S, or V-S, is apt to be in the kingdom of God. It is a hidden message saying, he who turns the constellations in the sky is fit or apt to live in the firmament. Okay, now we're trying to turn the page. I believe this will work. Okay, this is a new section. It's called, I think it's actually a new chapter, chapter 6, breaking out from the diagonal line. In the previous chapters, I focused on the diagonal line. Now remember, the diagonal line is in the V, okay, or the U, whatever it is. I believe they're both the same in Latin. My Latin is pretty rusty. I took 3 years of it in middle school. I think it's helped me quite a bit, but I struggle to read it. But so the V is the right hand side of the V is the diagonal line, and so the significance of that diagonal line is that as you move along in War of the Jews, you're also moving along in Luke. So when you have that diagonal line on the right-hand side of the V, the parallels are in order. They go in order. So that makes them even less likely and more kind of easy to spot and more obvious that it is intentional. Joseph Atwill shows that line in his book, Caesar's Messiah, in particular the edition that's called the Flavian Signature. And he lays out about 35 or 40 or maybe even more parallels that are in order. Like, as you go through one book, you go through the other book, and they're in order in each one, which even raises the unlikelihood of that being random. But when you find 250 parallels, you're beyond the I don't know how many standard deviations that would be, but certainly more than 5. Probably much more than that. 5 is already to 1,000,001 or something. I don't really. It's very, very unlikely that would be a coincidence. In the previous chapters, I focused on the diagonal line and various associated parallels, mostly with Luke parodying Jewish war. Yeah, so over there on that side of the diagram, most of the parallels are Luke parodying Jewish war, whereas on the left-hand side, most of them are Jewish war parodying Luke. But there are, on the right-hand side, there are some that are Jewish war parodying Luke. So the upshot is that they were written at the same time because they are in a conversation with each other. You can't have a conversation when one person is in, the year 30 and the other one is in the year 70. Okay. I will now describe some selected parallels which diverge more from this pattern and which are more likely to form part of the first revelation of the APTVS pattern, known only to the most senior rank of the Flavian secrecy cult. Through this and several following chapters, I will gradually piece the APTVS puzzle together, showing the reader each parallel and periodically showing their locations on the chart. And I'll begin with some parallels where Luke is still parodying Jewish war. You may find that you can judge their locations for yourself simply by knowing that Luke has 24 chapters plotted vertically, and Jewish war has just shy of 700 paragraphs plotted horizontally, or by referring back to the complete pattern. Again, that's on the thumbnail. The complete pattern is on the thumbnail to the video. As an example, next I compare Luke 13, which is about halfway up, with 2 groups of paragraphs in Jewish war. Firstly, paragraph 545 and paragraph 562, which are about 3/4 of the way across the chart near the right, i.e. the middle of the right-hand side of the V. And secondly, a string of paragraphs from 637 to 644, which is the middle of the S. And he says easy. I'm not sure why he says easy, but in the following parallels, some involve one location in Luke being parodied by multiple locations in Jewish war. This first one is a fascinating example, this time relating to Jesus and the adulterer, saying, "Let he who is innocent cast the first stone." Okay. Now, he's giving a little bit of background here from the perspective of the Romans coming to reclaim Jerusalem, which had revolted from them. Jerusalem is conveniently aligned with the description in the Jewish holy text, which reads, and he is referring to Isaiah chapter 1, 3 separate verses, number 1, number 21, and number 62. A vision of Jerusalem. How has the faithful city become a harlot? Jerusalem, the Lord's bride. This equates Jerusalem as being an adulterous bride. And it is a theme repeated several times throughout the Old Testament. Okay, now he's going to Jewish War, paragraph 545, which is book 5, chapter 3, verse 3. The Jews at Jerusalem went out to the women's towers of Jerusalem that the Old Testament refers to as an adulteress, and threw their stones at their own people and pretended to be vulnerable. The Roman soldiers attacked. However, Titus gave the order not to, and then the Jews surrounded them and threw stones at them. Okay, now we move forward to Jewish War 562, which is book 5, chapter 6, paragraph 3. Titus, I can see I'm not going to get through this parallel. We'll just go through the rest of this paragraph, and then we'll probably start over tomorrow at the very beginning of this. It's a very detailed one. So, but the verse in Luke is, I think, Luke 13, verses 2 to 17. So if you're interested, you can figure that out for yourself with these parallels. Okay, so Titus, who is to be revealed later as being both deified as a god and also the son of a deified god, Vespasian, has his balustrae or catapults around the valleys with Jerusalem in the middle. Titus catapults bend down to the ground to have a stone put on them and then lift up, casting stones at Jerusalem, what the Old Testament refers to as the adulteress. It also describes how the Jews were unable to operate their own catapults. The Jews cannot cast stones, so they perished or were removed. Well, I can see this is going to be interesting, but we'll have to get into it tomorrow. So thanks for tuning in today. Have a great